Well, nice to see so many familiar faces, former bosses, colleagues. No pressure, eh? I really don't mind if you interrupt and you want to have questions. Feel free. I've seen all of these slides before. So what I was going to do is just go through a little bit. If some of you are sharp-eyed and SEMPTE members, you might detect that I ripped off a very challenging SEMPTE webinar that I did, and I'll explain why. I'll also talk a little bit about some of the standards work, particularly relating to proprietary, license-free, and so forth. I'll also talk a little bit about virtualization and optimization of compression for broadband applications. And then that mother of subjects, I'll end with sort of UHD and HDR. So, I mean, just as an introduction, one of the biggest issues driving video compression at the moment is OTT, particularly HD delivery. UHD grabs all the news and the headline. HD is the business driver at the moment. And basically optimizing the broadband video performance compared to DTH, cable and satellite is the name of the game at the moment. As I said, there's lots of buzz around 4K and Ultra HD. A frank assessment, as many of you will have seen me having to get up on my perch and do a theatre pitch at IBC, is resolution alone is not enough to differentiate itself from HD or particularly 1080p services, that most people are battling their way and saying, how can we add HDR or wide colour gamut? As I said, we'll save the best till last and the most contentious, but we will talk about that a little bit later. The big issue at the moment is DTH. There's a lot of refreshes going on at the moment. I think there's a lot of challenge between public and pay TV broadcasters to work out quite what kind of infrastructure they need to provide, and also what audience they're going to address.
Already lost me. You've used OTT and DTH.
Over the top and direct to home.
What does that... I understand the second one.
OTT is broadband. It's sort of catch-up TV type thing, usually with a broadband provision. Online IPTV, bandwidth constrained. You know, a lot of the cable infrastructure providers, the simple reason why they're interested in new compression standards is to extend the reach. There is also another issue associated with multi-screen, that margins have been absolutely smashed for broadcasters because of the expectation to deliver across multiple platforms. Now, with AVC and possibly with HEVC, it opens up the provision for some kind of consolidation and using sort of a similar master and distribution format. But I would say you need to be careful in this area, because the programs that really appeal and the formats that really appeal have a close association with the kind of play-out device. So what works on your living room doesn't necessarily work as a format on your smartphone or tablet, and they're usually after a short-form version of it. You'll also see that there's a lot of clever jiggery-pokery done with graphics and branding so that they can have commonality in the logo bugs. And it's typically at those post-production stages that actually preclude any of this common asset through a workflow. And last of all, we really shouldn't forget the impact of mobile, because if you actually look at the, sort of the amount of, our children or the amount of sport consumed through mobile networks, that quickly makes you realise that it's bandwidth constrained, usually unicast IP type delivery. So that's a very serious consideration. Now, Cisco produced some very helpful stats. And even though this was yonks ago that I actually did this presentation, it's still true to say that from 2011 to 2016, video is the main growth area. If you look at any of the reports, any of the carriage, most of the traffic that's going through is sort of actually video related. Another truth at the moment, and the thing that a lot of people are dealing with, and a lot of the big entities these particular sessions where you meet a lot of people who've got some time and some skin in the game as far as the broadcast industry, you realise that there's a lot of infrastructure, the BBC, Arqiva, and all of that. They're trying to make a delicate balance between saying these have been our former cash cows, we're squeezed on margin, we're committed to delivering multi-screen type provision, but at the end of the day, even though everyone talks about OTT and catch-up, you're still saying that the vast majority of what people watch is sit-down TV, you know, sort of 75%. I would freely confess that the demographic has worrying tendencies in it. But I spent some time with a journalist in the States at CES who were saying that a lot of these youngsters who they were basing their catch-up expectation with revert to behaviour like their parents when they lead a less exciting lifestyle. So, you know, I think all things got to be considered there.
The point about MPEG-2 up there and the impact on broadcasters, it's worth pointing out in that very same context, Ofcom are removing spectrum from the broadcast DTT platform.
Yeah.
Starting this month in Selkirk, they'll start removing everything above, I think it's channel 50 or thereabouts, the 700 band, and squeezing everything that was up there down into the 605 and 600 bands. That's not going to stop because the mobiles lost the argument in WRC 15 2 years ago.
Yep.
They want the lot.
Yep.
And they don't care what happens broadcast.
Yep.
They think they can do it.
Yeah.
The question to you is, can they?
Well, I think...
keep it for later.
Well, I think I'll answer it directly now. The only thing that makes that a viable approach is the reducing of expectation for SD. Critical eyes are on HD at the moment, that basically most of the broadcasters in the shootouts that I go to, they're looking to run StatMux 1.7 to 2.2 megabits. And they're saying, is that quality adequate? Now, in the States, if you go to those kind of shootouts, they say yes. But it's really, really challenging. The amount of times I go to a shootout where they're saying, you know, the whole premise of doing this is a 15% saving on the basis that we can get one extra channel in. If you can do that, game on. But the ideal is to sell for one with the expectation of getting two in there. And that's purely, I mean, that's even commenting on the justification before spectrum is being aggressively taken away in the way that you're talking about there. Greenfield deployments are a gift for new compression standards. Double-edged sword. You only have to look at the press to realise the challenges that UHD is having, and it's a deliberate reason why I've put those kind of subjects later on. Software players are key to enabling new deployments. One of the biggest things, and I mean, I'm lucky, I get sent out to CES every year. It's the easiest introduction because it's the closest that I do come to a jolly, where I go out there and I'm just sent, go out there, you'll have to talk about it in our sales kickoff, but go out there and see what you think. Now, two things struck me when I went there. First of all, I was presented with a little rosette to say that it was my 10th year, and I hadn't realised that I'd been there for 10 years. And the other thing was this issue about software players, because, okay, all the glitz and the glamour of the main screens that you see, and I'll talk about those later and compare and contrast them, but this thing about software players and optimizing for broadband delivery goes hand in hand with compression improvements. So there was a lot to do with adaptive broadband ABR techniques, a lot to do with buffer management, and a lot to do with sort of delving quite heavily into the video syntax, because basically a lot of these tier one telcos realize that if they don't perform in this area, they're out of business. Basically, it shows the whole lineage of essentially MPEG standards. Now, most of us, I mean, particularly those of us who are from NDS or even before the IBA, NTL type days, were, you know, explicitly involved in sort of first generation development of these standards. I would say that, you know, sort of the AVC H.264, those standards are really, really good standards now. Any standard that comes along now to try and displace those standards will be doing a very, very good job. particularly with HEVC. It's got quite a tough act to follow, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think that these standards have all been very, very successful. I could have put loads on here concerning a lot of the proprietary standards that came along from Microsoft and Google. And I think that the only thing to comment is that MPEG's done a terrific job of a lineage of standards that have held together. When they've recognised that they've been pursuing the wrong path, they've jumped it very quickly and said, hang on guys, you know, you're getting too far away from the objective, you know, sort of like the object-based coding type work that was done in MPEG-4, where they said the only thing that people give a damn about is bitrate saving. Concentrate on that, junk this stuff, too complicated, can't be implemented yet. And I'm saying that actually a lot of the problems that we've got about multi-screen for representing different objects on different screens, that work that was done earlier in the MPEG generation could really resurrect itself. So up until sort of the early 2000s, we were into the AVC or H.264, predominantly what's behind HD broadcast, predominantly with what Ofcom are wrestling with, is saying, can we switch off MPEG-2 and rely upon HD set-top boxes and do a reasonable swap out? So that's the basis of a lot of the heritage or legacy type linear TV swap outs that we're doing at the moment. In terms of key technology introductions, all of the areas that most people think about, HEVC and VP9 or VP10, this, you know, sort of shows a continuing array of features. Any of the standards that have come around, like MPEG-2 now, you'd be surprised that basically the compression complexity and the platforms that people are running on, they all run the complete MPEG tool set. For AVC, H.264 and HEVC particularly, haven't even touched it. And there will certainly be some features in that tool set that were just flights of fantasy that just aren't possible to implement, or have been ruled out because by de facto, the decoder silicon that has to be able to decode these has run a particular course. And the only other point to actually make about all of these standards is the spec refers to the decoder. The artistic side is on the encoder, and there's an awful lot of things that actually get knocked out on the way because the decoder market is increasingly driven by a few players, and their interpretation of that specification often determines and calls foul for what the encoder vendors do. They're all based on exactly the same kind of coding loop, you know, entropy encoder, block-based spatial transforms, block-based motion compensation, you know, predictive coding, and then quantized transform coding and entropy type techniques. Nothing different. You know, there are a lot of people, I mean, you see these space cowboys who come along and say, oh, these MPEG standards, they're so inefficient, we can do it much, much better. A lot of what they're doing is they're not actually respecting the syntax, the transport syntax, and ripping that out. And I freely confess, you can make things a lot more efficient. If you're talking about contribution rates, you talk about JPEG 2K or any of the intra-frame production codecs. Yes, they can be done in a more efficient way, but I'd say for the contrast of standardized approach that's widely adopted and appropriate for distribution purposes, I'd say MPEG's done a really great job in terms of these standards. In terms of AVC, I mean, I suppose that was the big radical leap. You know, we had MPEG-1 or H.261, MPEG-1, 1.5. Okay, we're up to 2 now. Missed out MPEG-3 because I think something the Japanese didn't like that and went straight to MPEG-4. But when we got to MPEG-4 or AVC, we were really talking about some processing going on there in terms of the capability. And I think even now, whilst everybody assumes that the whole market is firmly bolted onto the HEVC because that's the latest and the best, fact of the matter is AVC is within all of your set-top boxes. It's available as a software player. the real area that gets me to squirm, and I don't often reject journals' requests for me to comment on things, but at the moment, the HEVC licensing area and MPEG-LA and the big license pools, a journalist came with a whole load of questions, and I said, do you know what, those questions are so brilliant, I'm not going to answer them because I'm not going to put down in writing, because there are so many pitfalls between the various authorities. I'll comment on it on a one-to-one basis, but actually that's a very thorny area. So what that's actually meant is that AVC as a player is dominant in the marketplace. And you'll see when I'm talking about a lot of the compression for OTT and mobile type applications, that really HEVC has got to displace this. And there is still a lot of mileage in the tool set that there is there, because anything that's done in compression is essentially a trade-off between functionality and performance and cost. And you can't simply assume that somebody's going to implement the latest and the best when access rates are improving, and all people are looking for is specific picture quality capabilities with respect to where they've come from, which is usually MPEG-2. The other thing to mention about MPEG-2 is it's still phenomenally successful, particularly in HD, for cable markets. And I think that assuming that everyone's jumped up to AVC, even within this country, is a hell of an assumption. And still, Ofcom are saying, can we actually mandate that we can go to SD AVC? Would simplify things a hell of a lot. And that's just going through. I mean, I think Gordon probably knows more about that than I do. Question?
Yeah, many years ago, Virgin Media as a sort of cable provider and others as a cable provider seemed to be gaining ground. Is that still the case?
Well,
or is cable dead?
Well, obviously I've got to be fairly careful here, because if I go saying...
There's only two of us in the room, so we can...
No, I think that what you're talking about is fundamentally, cable access technologies are improved unbelievably. That they are really setting the pace in terms of what they can actually deliver to the home. And some of the CCAP, DOCSIS type technologies are really setting the pace. And it's no surprise that the big backers of those kind of technologies are offering amazing services. Now, that's not to say that some of the people taking an alternative approach, so like BT with a multicast approach, aren't delivering tremendous, service provision over essentially twisted copper in many cases. But fundamentally, I think that there is so much drive behind, sort of high-speed access into the home that there are a lot of people who say that, cable does have the potential to take it all the way. The only thing that I would say on that is the consumption demographics. If things had continued where you were actually saying that linear TV delivered from terrestrial cable or satellite was continuing, and you were having the same criteria for delivery, cable would walk it at the moment. The fact of the matter is that now that viewership's fragmented, and that a lot of people are essentially using catch-up content, that favours things a little bit more for internet-type delivery, because you get involved in some caching issues. So I suppose it's the choice between a Ferrari and a Land Rover. It depends upon which terrain you're going over. Certainly, sort of in terms of the raw headline figure and the possibility of uncontended bandwidth, particularly with the new cable technologies, they are very, very promising. And, I think that's probably as fair as I can get it, given that I work for a company that one half of us is digital video and the other half is manically promoting CCAP. But I think the cable stuff's great. All right. Fair answer? All right.
Simple. The area in which I live, there's blokes working their little whatsits off, digging up the ground, laying green 4-inch diameter pipes for Virgin Media, and thinking, why?
Oh yeah. Oh well, I can exactly see the justification, because I mean, out in rural areas, it's a real problem. You know, and you know, you'll see sort of DirecTV and a lot of the custom satellite providers also trying to provide similar kind of provision, you know, sort of in, you know, sort of diverse geographic areas in the States. I think that, you know, and I mean, if you go to Asia, you know, a lot of the cable market is heavily driven there. A lot of the distribution within dense accommodation like flats and things like that, they put it through as being cable by start. And, you know, a lot of it is mini distribution hubs within there. So, yeah, there is a lot of drive towards that. And in no way should we assume that all of these IP-based technologies are solely based on, you know, broadband type provision. You know, cable has a big part to play. Okay, so the big dilemma is most of it, and most of the people who've been here today who've been involved in compression, it's all about being bandwidth reduction. The raise VQ thing, people might sort of say, what the hell's he talking about there? Because it's purely for hybrid services. Getting an equality between broadband or cable-based provision or DTH. That's the only instance that people are talking about raising VQ. A lot of it, they're trying to basically maintain the level of quality that they've got, squeeze more channels in. So hence the comment about most go for bandwidth reduction. The exception is likely to be OTT HD, because some of it, frankly, is really struggling at the moment. And, you know, sort of getting the reach, getting the quality. The statistics associated with buffering on a service are frightening for service providers. HEVC is an enabler for 4K. It won't work without it. And I mean, every one of these standards has one particular benefit. And if you like, the killer benefit for UHD is the variable block size and some of the coding tools that it's got. Everybody thinks, I go back to the statement before, it's nothing new really. You know, there are a lot more possibilities that they've allowed, but it's not really that much of a radical step from AVC. And I keep making this point because a lot of what multi-screen is based on is AVC type technology. Sure, you know, your latest iPhone has an HEVC decoder in it, but by far the most applications that people are using are AVC based. And we're still, even for smartphones and even in the realm of software downloads, into the issue about standardization and compatibility and so forth. Decoder for HEVC is 3 times the complexity that it was for AVC. On the encoder, it's 10 to 12 times. And people love those kind of statistics. And the first time I put them up, you know, every anorak in the audience would be having a go, oh, I think it's 15 times. No, as you know, we've done it. And I think that, you know, by and large, 3 times for the decoder or 10 to 12 times for AVC. But this thing about programmable platforms, virtualization, the whole thing about implementing on server, big impact in the market.
You've got a very interesting asterisk next to the 50% improvement. This is when technology is fully mature.
Yeah, now. Yeah,
so where are we now, and how long before that maturity hits?
Very, very good question. On HD, I would say 35–40%. On UHD, 55–60%. And it's purely because of that block size variability. You can achieve stunning efficiencies for HEVC compression encoding versus AVC. The moment that you start going down, and it's that variable block size and some of the coding decisions that get the entropy out of the picture, particularly for large screen sizes, that it really, really cuts in. The moment that you go from HD downwards, it gets to be more awkward. And once you get down to multi-screen, it's very awkward because you're talking about huge complexity in terms of decoder complexity and encoder complexity. And people are sort of saying, I can't see the benefit. This is Emperor's New Clothes, because the tool set is predominantly for the larger resolution formats. It does require more hardware, you know, in terms of buffers to actually add those that additional capability. I talk a lot about the syntax structure. I'd send you all to sleep if I went into that, and bearing in mind we're half an hour into it. But I mean, if you want to know it, there are some great books on it. That H.264 had a banding problem for 8-bit. And one of the reasons why HEVC drove for the main profile to 10-bit was to address this banding problem. We all know it because in contribution links, they upped the codecs from 8 to 10-bit, and the distribution format stayed predominantly 8-bit. In early UHD screens, you can even see 8-bit quite clearly. The picture looks a bit soft and fuzzy. If you use Azure converters, unless you actually use Azure Plus converters, people will swear blind that they're showing you 10-bit UHD HEVC, and you say, well, go on then, take a sample of that, and you tell me whether that's 8 or 10-bit. But the banding thing is a big issue, you know, the 8 to 10 bits. And one of the things that actually does surprise a lot of people is the penalty for 8 to 10-bit. Mathematically, it's better for 10-bit because you're reducing the prediction error, even though people think that you're adding more bits. Whether you're actually getting to that level, and it alludes to your point of whether you're actually on that 50% improvement, is a little bit questionable. I'd say it's in the balance. There's lots of quarter-pell interpolation and different filters that are actually used, basically taking a lot of the techniques that we used in MPEG-2 and AVC and just taking them a stage further. There's a lot borrowed from the AVC standard. One of the other things that I would say is Mike will remember all of the effort that went into noise reduction, prediction, all of the added worth that you put up front of an MPEG encoder. A lot of those useful flags and traits for video have been pulled into standards, usually for edge detection, usually to improve how you actually use the tool set. But a lot of what's gone on within AVC and HEVC has been essentially pulling things that they've said, the vendors have got up to that kind of thing. We're going to pull that into the mainline standard. And curiously, that's also happened on the decoders. For those of you who've done a Sky upgrade and gone from the old HD box to the Sky Q box, if you look very closely and if you don't change your screen just before you do it, you'll see the pictures are a lot sharper because they're using a lot of quite sophisticated noise reduction techniques on the decoded output. You know, there's a lot of emphasis on those kind of things that people do pick up on those. So essentially, for HEVC, it is being used in OTT. We're no longer in that sort of legacy set-top box type scenario. We're genuinely into downloadable players. So it's a better user experience. This lower CDN and storage cost, that's a massive issue. That if you think that you're bandwidth constrained for DTH type applications, you wait until you have accountants paying CDN costs on anything that becomes remotely possible. They have a heart attack. So, you know, we're talking about more streams, increased reach. The wireless operators, even though you've got this battle between DTH and mobile operators, the ultimate irony is it's the same kind of material that's going on it. It's just a different master, you know, putting it onto those networks, you know. And then you sort of get onto ultra high definition, so improve on HD user experience using the latest screen technologies. I'll talk a bit about that. A clear way that it does win is on 4K VOD movie distribution. So it's broadening the release of features. But where I'd say that it hasn't worked, or it's struggling to get its definition yet, is in live sports for UHD sports type delivery, particularly at the kind of access bandwidths and to allow service provision to scale from the 4K resolution services to HDR services. And that's not to dispel any of the enthusiasm for BT Sport or Sky. They're doing a great job, but they desperately want to be able to evolve those services on. to, add clear water in terms of quality between HD and UHD. What I did was, within our company, we have a quarterly review of all of the standards activity. And I basically, sat and thought, oh, this is interesting. I'm going to be in front of an esteemed bunch of people who will be saying, where's it all going? For internet video coding, people are looking for royalty-free. They're looking for different ways of doing things. So you've basically got two candidates. You've got the VCB, Video Coding for Browser. You see no awkward acronym there. It's spelt out for me. Good French people helping me along there. And then you've got the Chinese universities working on the IVC. There's still a lot of work going on concerning AVC. It's still got a lot of scope, got a lot of traction within the marketplace. For HEVC, there's loads of work going on. And some of the more interesting areas, and I genuinely mean that, because having started off working at Sony Broadcast on a lot of the telecine transfers of film to HD, I actually think all of this colour space, wide gamut, HDR stuff is really, really interesting. That's proper science, none of this noughts and ones and faster processors and things like that. There's actually some seriously interesting stuff that will make your head hurt, behind a lot of that. So we will talk about that a little bit later. Just in terms of the standardization effort, I'm a lucky man because I get to play around on making material for trade shows. I mean, those of you who come to IBC, I get given free rein. I get a lot of support from people like the BBC and Dolby. We're supposed to be neutral on HDR techniques. It's a bit like CA. The broadcasters tell us what to do. But you've got to know your onions in this area. And I'd say anyone who's lucky to go to NAB, the ATSC 3.0 decision, that's going to have a major impact on, sort of not only services in the US, but also services in Asia. There is work on future coding gains. Now, you can see a slowing up in this because it always used to be the mandate was a 50% improvement. They're now saying, easing up a little bit on what's actually possible with these kind of techniques. This is just to give you an idea of the main stakeholders, what they're interested in terms of HDR, virtual reality. They're getting onto the more difficult areas. I was actually posting onto our company's intranet all of the Times' article on the death of 3D TV. And I loved it because it actually made it to the editorial of, basically it was a sad indictment of our industry and how it can get totally carried away in it. And the fact that it was so succinctly covered in the Times, I loved it, the way it was put. Got to be very, very careful with UHD and VR. UHD, I think my opinion is that the consumers get it. And sooner or later, in the next 3-4 years, you're going to go down and it's going to be a difficult decision actually finding an HD set. Most people are buying it, and it's setting the expectation for us to deliver UHD services to replace the HD services. So the buying public gets it. It's whether we as broadcast manufacturers can actually deliver, and specifically for live. And that's a challenge and a test for us. This is, what are we talking? Yeah, this is just talking a little bit more about HDR, virtual reality, panoramic stuff. I've always got to be careful with virtual reality because the immediate application that's an absolute no-brainer for that, they often have exhibitions that coincide with CES or NAB in Las Vegas to talk about the use of electronic art and nubile women. Is that the best way of putting it? And I have done complete blogs, because you're of a generation that I can talk to, where Craig Charles in Red Dwarf shows exactly what the prospects are for virtual reality. And the thing I loved is that I was actually been disparaging for a colleague who made a very unfortunate tweet that made an association of VR going hand in hand with the porn industry, that since he's my American colleague, had me laughing out loud, and I suppose is why I'm viewed as a safe pair of hands to him. But the VR industry, if you were looking around CES, a lot of the private booth demonstrations and justifications of it were going down a distinctly seedy line there. But the ones that did impress me, there were a couple. Planning, building planning, what the hell is this going to look like? There were some great demonstrations there. The Smithsonian brought it alive when you actually looked at it. Natural History Museum, absolutely fantastic. You know, some of the things that are left field, and, you know, sort of I put my, I sort of state where I think that the first application is going to come is going to be, say, a car advert that's going to basically say, okay, Oculus Rift or any of the other VR headsets, we are going to try and do an advertorial based on mainline TV to basically squirt out a QR code to get people to VR access to do a virtual tour of a car. And I think that is something waiting to happen. Somebody's going to do something like that, because this second screening pull-through, and it all relies upon getting a certain number of VR headsets into the market. If you look at the challenges that Facebook are having with VR and the relative positioning of it, and you look in any of the mainline press, you see they're having a lot of difficulty. They're searching for that killer application beyond gaming, but it'll come. It'll come. But we need to be very, very careful, because on the one hand, we're in a traditional business for revenue paying for pay TV that has shown that it kicks back on certain technologies where they're a little bit too tenuous. So I think it does have its place, but we've got to carefully position it for it to be a success. Right, so I've tried to make this as neutral as possible. There are some branding issues associated with harmonic-specific products, but I've tried to keep it as a broad brushstroke as possible. So the next stage is essentially what we show at IBC or what's shown at NAB associated with advances in compression. And some of it's a little bit of a liberal take on it, but given the fact that the standards boys say they're working on HDR and wide color gamut, I can. So the first area is compression OTT optimization. The other thing is virtualization, cloud, software as a service. That's becoming a big issue now. In terms of distribution. It's tricky for us to actually handle it, and handling it in the context of us being used to big head-end operators and how they're actually going to migrate to a data center, how much cross-flow there is between the back office work and the distribution platforms is immediately up for debate. There's a lot of very worthy activity going on in AIMS associated with post-production formats, and I'll give you the seeds to go exploring that. I'll talk a little bit about 4K workflows and end up with HDR implementations. OTT challenges. This is the biggest issue for our business at the moment, actually making the expectation to deliver the same quality that you deliver to the living room as a mobile experience. It's a challenge just in terms of the expectations on picture quality. It's a challenge actually mapping it in terms of consumption patterns. And lastly, it's a challenge in terms of the number of devices. I know I paraphrase what there is there, but you know, each of these areas, you know, sort of in terms of video quality for the, you know, first screen expectations, because for a lot of people it is. In terms of the consumption rates, CDN costs, the days of actually experimenting with a program, and if it's wildly successful, but you haven't charged enough for it, and you're not going to recover your CDN costs, I'm sure the accountants are going to have something to say to you. And in terms of the number of devices and the rate of churn in terms of devices, that's absolutely frightening if you're trying to build head-end provision to cater for the number of devices, let alone the shift in emphasis between them. One of the things that we're working on is basically screwing the nuts out of the formats, compression standards that are already there, and the delivery techniques. Now, some of these trials that go ahead for VQ are often done as a balanced subjective-objective type trial. Now, I freely admit that what a lot of the broadband delivery is highly optimized between your subjective impressions of it, and, if you like, diverting a little bit away from the objective test and measurement systems, but that's what's making a lot of these OTT systems work. The one thing that I would say is that there are a lot of proprietary standards in there, but where there are millions, if not billions, of PCs out there with players in them or decoders in there, this issue about 100% standards compatible with the tool sets and the buffers is a key thing. And that's really what I'd look to. A lot of the challenges for some of the work that we're doing are actually proprietary in nature. I'm not dismissing them, and you could equally argue that some of the movie streaming services actually would like to ring-fence their application by having a unique downloadable player. So I'm just trying to be entirely neutral about this. You know, there are pros and cons with either approach. A lot of the techniques that have been used in broadcast are quite old, you know, sort of the BT, I'm just trying to remember the testing measurement that BT, you know, put together, and all of the Tektronix analyzers and so forth. They have a very predefined way of actually analyzing compression coding. But it is possible to actually go back to human standards based and actually aggregate picture delivery over the typical kind of chunking or packet delivery, temporal characteristics that are available with broadband, and do a much better job of actually implementing AVC or HEVC to make them more refined for broadband delivery. There's an awful lot of emphasis going on behind this for obvious reasons with the shift in terms of consumption patterns. You'll see a lot of it is based on, you know, sort of things like, say, 720p 60 type content being delivered, you know, sort of traditionally at 4, and the expectation is to try and halve it, get it down. And basically that's by playing tricks in terms of the coding tool set. It's basically trying to aggregate in terms of delivery and accept the fact that video is a bursty medium, and that if you're a little bit clever about how you're actually working it, you can implement a StatMux on steroids, you know, to sort of actually deal with the allocation. That's trivializing it quite a lot, but this is one of the areas that a lot of people are basically trying to improve the picture quality on OTT, and particularly sort of the networks, and to reduce the kind of buffering. So most of our customers are after improved profitability and rapid deployment in terms of these technologies. They're looking to sort of switch them in specifically on high consumption circuits, because quite simply they're getting crippled by CDN costs. That most people associate compression efficiencies with the classic DTH, there being a performance picture quality trade-off with the bit rate and the amount of satellite tariff you pay. But really, the really tough areas are in the CDN type areas that we're dealing with. Another area that actually directly relates to the kind of platforms that you're running on is this issue about virtualization. Now, I mean, I've probably been shot, and we are being recorded actually, so it's, but I'm speaking to a broadcast audience here. But in terms of picking up on a lot of these alien terms in terms of VMware, OpenStack, probably Amazon Web Services, these guys operate in a massive industry to which, you know, we are a microscopically small aspect of it, and we are trying to get traction within those industries. That's the first thing to say. The other thing to say is that a lot of these big media organisations, their back office gets it. It is running all of these kind of things. The video has been the exception based on being difficult to contain within performance expectation and has largely required bespoke hardware. But the time has come that for all but the most cutting edge type UHD or HEVC applications, we've got to run on these kind of platforms. So that's really driving an awful lot of what's going on. I only put this slide up so that you can actually see that what people are actually talking about are either dedicated servers, virtualized provision, software as a service or cloud-based provision, or multi-cloud type provision. I really accept that a lot of the issues associated with cloud are convincing broadcasters that they're secure services. And that's one of the reasons why the only paper I'm doing for NAB is associated with security for cloud-based services for operating, that's a really huge issue. The simple thing is that if it's done correctly, it can be just as robust as, if not more robust than a traditional data center. But the problem is with a lot of these things is that the skill-based, particularly the skill-based who's got the right mix of cloud-based technology and video, that's really what people are looking for from a vendor, that they've got competent coverage in those areas. So for all of our products, and for all of the typical kind of workflow from ingest, playout, graphics, transcoding, encrypting, and delivery, you used to look at those being very, very specific products within there and product functionalities that were defined by interfaces. You'd know which vendor you'd go for. But basically, now, from beginning to end, perhaps with the exception of monitoring in the middle, most vendors are saying, it's open. We need to grab as much of that footprint as we can to actually deliver a product to actually counteract the kind of price erosion that a lot of the reasons why manufacturers are showing such, sort of complete services, because genuinely we're moving away from the traditional product-based approach to more looking features, software, application, cloud-based services. Let's have a look. So, I mean, this just sort of really, breaks down the big areas. So, sort of both of the orchestration, both for DTH and multi-screen, as well as channel origination. A lot of the economics that are actually driving it is no longer a hardware infrastructure type business. And if you want to see how rapid this is going on, you actually look at any of the conferences that are associated with post-production, you'll realize that people are using these services at a pace, sort of in terms of adoption. I wanted to talk a little bit about the private cloud, public cloud type thing, because this has is a real big issue. I made the point that for a lot of broadcasters, a lot of people have concerns about security in this, and I'm not surprised. You look at a lot of what happened with TVMon 5, a lot of those hacking type issues, and a lot of the vulnerabilities that are associated with media organisations, probably unfairly have been associated with the cloud, because most of that was about how their staff actually dealt with their own personal security and how they actually facilitated bots, the recruitment of a number of ganged machines, how sophisticated a lot of these cyber attacks are in the fact that they're multi-stage. So they, first of all, recruit numerous machines, knock out the antivirus, establish comms back there. And often the poor individual who makes the mistake of clicking on the link and actually establishing them to get a foothold is just making a fundamental error in terms of introducing it. But if you want to look at an interesting area, you look at the security area with there. Done correctly, and there's a reason why these big names on the public cloud are so good at what they're doing, because they really know what they're doing in terms of the security thing. So I think that what we will find is that a lot of the problems actually defining where the root cause of any security breach is difficult enough, and the rumour mill will, you know, escalate what goes on. And unfairly, I think a lot of it gets attributed to some very useful tools that there are there. But understanding the security issues and the security breaches is a fundamental issue for pay TV, because it's not worth doing if your content gets ripped, if a media organisation gets brought down, your whole set-top box infrastructure gets compromised. That's why sort of preaching a little bit on, you know, sort of the private and public cloud areas. And a lot of people think that if they can actually see all of the servers in a nice building that's bloody chilly when you go into it, that they're safe. And that's just a misconception. One other, we've done quite a lot, and I'm not going to make this an advertorial for what we've been doing. We've introduced a service a bit like iPlayer and Sky Go with a tier 1 broadcaster, and that's been a real challenge for us to do. You know, we've learned a lot of things. You know, it's been essentially taking our workforce and transforming them from being IPR represented as hardware and products to IPR represented as services. It's also been sort of this whole DevOps thing that I think, in terms of saying it's a challenge to do it, it's a challenge in terms of how you manage an organisation and change it over, because the skill sets needed are similar but different enough that they need careful handling. So, you know, you look at, you know, sort of the cloud size in terms of the number of nodes, the number of services. You see that this is radically different from, you know, sort of a public broadcaster, you know, on Freeview. You know, the requirements are very, very different. And the business model, you know, the ad insertion type models, they're all things that we're familiar with, but wrapped up in a different guise, and in a guise that does require bespoke development. You know, I just put this up so that people can associate, you know, where we actually feature in a much, much bigger ecosystem. We're used to going glass to glass, camera to screen. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, yeah, you see, you know, a number of traditional vendors are present there, but by virtue of the fact that we're operating in this kind of virtualized cloud infrastructure, there are a lot of other established players who are making up quite a diverse group of business partners. I make all of the justifications in terms of commercial, technical, and operational. I won't go into them, because you could look at a basic cloud book. They're up there on the slides. The slides will be later. But this is a big issue. But I mean, fundamentally, as with all things, there are some people who just go for it for the hell of it, and there are other people who are a little bit cautious and need some justification. Everybody talks about the cloud. Our business is somewhere between product and appliance. For some of the greenfield applications, they're adopting the cloud and they're getting very, very useful experience. But there is some big churn about to happen, say for, you know, MPEG-2 delivery provision, where somebody will look at that as a business case and said, that's a known quantity in terms of delivery. You know, we could transition from heavy iron to servers, you know, and genuinely do that as a distributed service. That's just a thought for the future when the emphasis starts to change in terms of service provision. A lot of people will be talking about IP standards, and I know Mr. Acronym here looking carefully at the screen saying, what's coming? A lot of people have been talking, haven't they, about 70/2022-6. They're also talking about some of the video services forum work associated with audio, and then wrapping it all up. All very good stuff, all done under AIMS. SEMPTI are also hugely active in this area because, I mean, whilst we talk about video, audio, and data as essence streams, you get into frightening complexity once you actually try and get into IP-based timing models in a video perspective. And that should just frighten everybody enough not to ask me any questions about acronyms on those kind of things. In terms of all of these 2022 standards, everyone looks, in terms of 2022-6, that's the one that everyone talks about, uncompressed video. The really, really interesting ones are things like the -7 one, which are seamless protection switching for IP data. Now, I deliberately dropped the 2022 thing because any of you who watched D34 will realise that it used to be an ASI switch network where it had seamless redundancy on it. It then changed over to being an IP-based service where it was basically doing packet seamless packet redundancy switching that is identical to that approach there. Anybody who's actually trying to use an MPLS network or any kind of IP delivery will be really, really interested in that. And you're seeing that a lot of people were initially talking about 2022-6, but really what they should be interested in for redundancy, robustness of service, and actually making it delivered over either bespoke or public internet is really interested in -7. There are some other really, really interesting areas that I think SEMPTE is doing quite a lot of work on. You'd quite rightly say, oh, why are all these WSI standards existing only for uncompressed when we'd like to see them for compressed, particularly in production workflows of things like TICO. And a lot of the work that SEMPTE are doing is actually expanding some of the high bitrate media stuff, the FECs, the headers. So really, 2022 is a suite that's made famous by one hit single, which is -6, but there are other tracks that you should go and sample because they fundamentally are more useful. I also give a plug for AIMS. I mean, I think that has been a success in terms of stopping all the vendors making it go proprietary, because that's the big wonder, because this kind of transition's only useful if enough people get behind it. And they've done a great job in conjunction with AMWA, Video Services Forum and SEMPTE to actually wrap that up. And there are a lot of guys who've got a hell of a lot more patience on standards bodies than I have actually getting all of these things. I always have respect for people who can sit on these standards meetings because I can't do it, but that's my failing. Conventional camera curves, you've got the usual log characteristic, and then unfortunately it just goes wrong. No, I'm not interested anything beyond that. What you'd really like to get to is this kind of camera log curve where you can particularly add at the high end for all of the spectrals and also at the low end for the blacks. And people often forget that a lot of the high dynamic range stuff that people are talking about, it is a ratio adding at the bottom and at the top. So most of the cameras that you're seeing on the market are trying to have the best of both worlds. I'm in the UK now here. I don't think I'd be shot dead, but a lot of people are looking for compatibility at the lower end with SDR displays, plus also have the top headroom to cater for there. We are supposed to be neutral as a implementer of high dynamic range technology, and strictly speaking, for a compression vendor like us, the only thing we give a damn about is seamlessly encoding and decoding and taking the control data. Doesn't sound very glamorous, but it gets to be quite complicated when you're trying to do workflows, and actually passing this kind of stuff without touching it is very, very difficult. In terms of high dynamic range, and it does feature, and somebody can't say that I'm rabbiting on about my favourite subject, this is featuring in where all the standards bodies want to go. If you look at your home TV, you'll realise that the signal that's actually been mapped into the box is up to 100 nits. Because I had some wise arse at the front of a presentation that I was doing said, oh, my screen's a hell of a lot brighter. And I said, you've just proved my point, Sonny. Television screens are sold on the prospect of huge brightness. And most of the advanced features that people are looking at, even if they've got a UHD screen, is essentially taking a 100 nit signal, and if it's a moderate TV, say in the last 3-4 years, mapping it to 400 nits. If they've got an obscene amount of money to spend and they go to CES, you're probably talking, 3,000-4,000 of the latest OLED screen. Film, 48 nits. darkened environment, limited in terms of the dynamic range, but it's got wonderful in terms of the colour gamut, or as the 70 guys always say, Ian, you should be talking about colour plane if you're talking about colour gamut and HDR. And that's why I haven't put any of those pictures up there, because I didn't want anyone calling foul on that. Digital cinema doesn't add that much. It's only up to 108 nits, you know, even for the latest laser projectors. You then get onto the interesting areas for what we've seen for high dynamic range, where for certain technologies, they'll have a very high headline figure, going up to possibly 1800, 2000 nits. I'd like to know what Brexit will actually have on the impact of us having to obey the power laws associated with consumption on TVs. Because you could genuinely get it that we could say, we don't give a rat shit about how much power this thing consumes, and you'd have a nuclear reactor style TV in the corner that could achieve Dolby's 10,000 nits in the corner. I don't think it's going to happen. I think that there'll be a few fires and a few complaints about that kind of thing. Go on. Yeah,
and there won't be enough time for it to get to their sort of nitty-gritty for many, many years. So stick with what we've got now.
Oh, damn, we've got a realist in the audience. Because my whole thing was that you know, wait until you see people displaying 4,000 nits and you see the power connector melting, you know, in the corner.
3 kilowatts.
Is that in the same room that I've just thrown away the 100-watt light bulb and put a 5-watt LED in?
Yeah, you got it. You got it. So
they will deliver the TV set up so it's so dim that will use 100 watts.
Yeah.
And then you'll have to change it to use the high brightness with 1.5 kilowatts.
Yeah, I'm always upset when I have to put my reading glasses on to tie my shoelaces because we've got some eco-friendly bulb in there that's just completely inadequate.
What's the level you could get on OLEDs, best OLEDs?
Now, you bring the question and you bring me back. OLEDs, the UHD Alliance specifies 2 levels of adherence for HDR. One which is for the QLED type, quantum dot type screens, which have a much higher headline figure. For OLED, it's around 600 to 800 nits, but it goes much deeper in terms of the blacks.
What do they behave differently to a plasma then?
No, that's a good question, that, because plasma got junked because because they were just eco nightmares. You know, now I've got to be careful here because there is a reason why OLED has had such a difficult introduction. LG have done a fantastic job, and I think that they've probably overcome a lot of the difficulties associated with these organic screen production. And the thing that really shows that is that Sony have backed OLED. That now, if you looked at CES, and I will get onto that slide, and if you'll just hold that thought, there's a dual specification for UHD Alliance in terms of one that's essentially the LED technologies and one for the OLED technologies, so that, you know, it's mainly middle-aged men who've got stupid amounts of money and they'll go for the biggest figure. And there is a little bit of education needed between OLED and QLED, you know, and I'll go through that in a couple of slides, okay?
Is there a third level of that, there's the middle-aged men with too much money, and then there's the old men who've got reality?
Could be. Or just who sit in the bath reading books. You know, so, I mean, you know, the upshot is that you're trying to create the wow effect. And that HDR needs to be implemented along with wide colour gamut. Now, one of my favourite subjects, and I'm usually viewed as a safe pair of hands, but I have done some dangerous things, particularly commenting on 70 Bits and Bytes, where I locked horns with Matthew Goldman about high dynamic range for HD or high dynamic range for UHD. And we entertained a taxi driver amazingly arguing about this on the way to, was it your centenary event in Australia? And this taxi driver was in tears laughing at us arguing over this. But basically, HDR needs to be implemented with wide colour gamut, and I stand by the fact that you could actually apply a lot of these techniques to HD, but a lot of the people are trying to sell new ways of viewing things or new screens. So I really think HDR goes hand in hand with UHD, but some esteemed alternative views are available. So just in terms of television signal chain, I'm not trying to teach you to suck eggs. I'm very quickly trying to get to the fact that some approaches like hybrid log gamma by the beloved BBC have basically a scene referred technology, and others are display referred. So essentially one of them is assuming that the ultimate that you are trying to map it to is up to 10,000 nits, which is the Dolby approach, which has more of a cinematic feel to it, but it is getting rapid adoption in terms of movie streaming, in terms of those kind of VOD and catch-up assets. The challenge for them is whether they can actually prove it for dynamic metadata and deal with all of the scaling parameters that are associated in the live broadcast environment. And those are the kind of issues that ATSC 3.0 are trying to deal with. So there are two approaches there. Everyone says which one will dominate, and I say none of them will, because all of the cinematic standards are either HDR10 or Dolby Vision, and enough titles are existing in there that a broadcaster is going to be presented with all of those assets. At the same time, the ultimate application for UHD, HDR is the kind of thing that BT Sport and Sky are doing, which is live sports. So you've got that immediate contrast between cinematic and live production. And the thing that very nearly wrecked my summer holiday to Iceland was trying to do a full UHD live workflow with an F55 camera going all the way through the distribution processes and to actually handle all of the HDR data. That is really, really tricky. It's really difficult. And I was so pleased when I was told for NAB I couldn't have any live equipment on the booth, because it actually, I think that all of the metadata parsing can be done, but it is getting frighteningly complex, and there are a lot of issues for SEMPTI DVB to run through. And even for one instance, I'm pleased I proved I did it. I learned a hell of a lot about doing, grading, about passing things on, about the scaling and the rendition on different screens. Some things you don't want to do again, and you particularly don't want to do it again when there aren't any standards about, because they are difficult. Now, this was, you asked the question about HDR, and as the best presenters, they ramble on with a couple of slides, but I will get on to the screen technologies after this slide. I've talked about all of the schemes, and basically there are 4 runners and riders for high dynamic range. HDR10, that's, if you like, your Escort L. It's in everything. It's on your Blu-ray player, it's on your screen. If you buy something and it's got HDR on it, it will be HDR10. Dolby Vision, if you went around any of the CES booths, their marketing department, and a lot of them are former Harmonic colleagues who are there, they did a fantastic job of getting Dolby Vision implemented on all of the screens. It's basically a bolt-on to HDR10 to add fidelity onto it. The BBC, in conjunction with NHK, and that's my obvious typo that I spotted down the road, they've worked on hybrid log gamma. It is a 2020 scheme, but it does have that backwards compatibility with that 709 curve. Got to be particularly careful on this backwards compatibility issue, because most broadcasters want one scanner at an event, and if their revenue is driven by HD SDR services. If you make those HD SDR services look rubbish, they don't give a damn about how good the UHD HDR pictures, because you've impacted the fundamental revenue earner. So backwards compatibility is a massive issue. And then you get technical or advanced HDR, which is purporting to be a best of all worlds and can deal with the other 3 standards and actually present it. There's a lot of information, even in those slides, about HDMI compatibility. For those of you who've probably got too much money and going down to Richer Sounds and trying to buy sets, be very, very careful what you buy. You know, take as much and pay attention as much as possible to, if they're showing you HDR content, don't be fooled if they do it on a USB key. Look at what version of HDMI is available. And if the little boy in the shop can't tell you, go and find out. Because I have bought and taken back so many screens in France, Germany, the US, trying to stage these kind of demos. If I tell you that one screen manufacturer has 12 different decoder builds associated with what they're doing, and the level of performance of HDR varies across all of them, you'll see that that is enough to ruin anyone's summer holiday trying to get those kind of demos to work with live screens. Now, this is your slide, specifically put in here, you know, so in terms of Samsung, they adopt the OLED technology. QLED. You see, that's failing eyesight, that, isn't it? But they back a QLED. They go up to a very high headline figure. The quantum dots do look very, very impressive. They go very high. A little bit noisier in terms of the picture. If you actually look at them and you look at the feel of them, they don't have that plasma OLED type feel to them, but they do have that headline figure and they do make the speculars look good. What Samsung were pushing were the expansion in the colour volume, and this issue about colour washout and widening the viewing angle. There were a lot of demonstrations that were showing that it isn't middle-aged men plonked in the middle of the screen who want to watch it, but the whole family. So there was a lot of emphasis on technologies to widen the viewing angle. The particularly interesting area is in terms of what feature support they've got, like hybrid log gamma and HDR10. LG, OLED. Yes, I like these actually. And I was very angry that the LG screen that they shipped me made it to the office and then got purloined when it was supposed to be in my living room. But you see, it's showing that I'm not just making it up. 800 nits. Better blacks, plasma-like feel to it. In terms, you know, it's horses for courses. Some people prefer that very, very bright quantum dot screen. Some people don't like OLEDs because they think they're too smeary, washed out. This is the kind of criticism that Pioneer used to get for their plasma screens. You've got to look and see what you like, but a lot of people like OLEDs. Is that a fair assessment? Yeah. They were frighteningly thin. I like the idea of the magnetic mounts. I asked one of my colleagues to actually show me how the magnetic mounts work, and he nearly lost his fingers, because once you get into a certain proximity to the wall, it's going, whether your fingers are behind it or not. Absolutely fantastic. It's best entertainment out, and if you can repeat that in Richer Sounds, watch. You know. So they were also talking about viewing angle. Had easily the most comprehensive HDR support. And I keep banging on about this because you've got to look at it. If you're buying a particular service, particularly you will have to guess what broadcasters are going to adopt at this stage. But it is a moving area.
What are they sending out at the moment? It only seems to be two, really, isn't it?
Well, at the moment, HDR10 is being used, particularly on the VOD and OTT channels. Hybrid log gamma is being used. The degree to which SMPTE are successful with dynamic metadata is the clincher for the introduction of other HDR approaches. The way I view it, and I'll freely be contradicted by anybody, but I think that the Home Cinema Brigade are going to establish patterns, because basically people going out buying Blu-ray screens, they're already having an influence on broadcasters saying we have to handle HDR10. It's all content driven. Who actually grades according to what standard? I am seeing a lot of the most difficult tech days I have are associated with mix and match of HDR techniques between live and VOD catch-up type scenarios.
Yeah, you've got the basic problem. you've got the basic issue that because PQ is display referenced, the grade that you do is for the display that you've got, which is whatever they have. Well, actually, the studios will mandate down to the almost a serial number because they like the feel, even though the Sony and the Canon sets apparently have the same luminosity. Now, how does that relate to an uncontrolled environment like television? You can see how it works well to a theatrical projection, while HLG saying, well, here's the scene, sort it out with a television set. And incidentally, you can do the OOTF, which is a power law, depending on how bright the thing is. Just think of how your iPad works in terms of producing a picture that you can see.
Yeah.
So that's part of the issue. And of course, for television, we keep on adding things. So you take your football match, camera output, slap a bug on there, the score on there, bring the action replay interstitial in. They are all different. And how the hell you're going to grade that in real time is going to be very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And that's basically, I mean, the fact that we watch television, usually not in total darkness, and normally not in the best place to watch.
Yeah. No, I think you sum up, sort of all of the difficult points there. CES is great to go for. I mean, I have a fantastic time looking at all of the content, but I will say that a lot of the content that I've graded has been graded with specific television screens in mind, and you can go badly wrong if you just go for a grading monitor and you don't actually have a representative consumer screen, because grading on a 4,000 or sort of above monitor can be quite distracting, and you can end up with some really weird results. And also, if you've got some very enthusiastic people who like the colours to pop, that's an expression that I hate, because several people have actually created absolute, sort of Hammer House of horror type things. And they say, look at this, isn't it tremendous, Ian? And I sort of say, yeah, but it doesn't look anything like the original. It looks gaudy. Can I have SDR version, please? Anyway, Sony, big change. And this shows this thing. Most people were avoiding OLED. Sony backed it. They're still saying they wouldn't tell me what the price was and when the availability. But the mere fact that they're adding it brings, is quite an interesting dynamic. It's quite a proud company in terms of, sort of their Trinitron history and things like that. And then, of course, Panasonic, again, supporting a wide range of standards. I keep mentioning the point about ATSC 3.0. Dolby Vision was widely deployed at the CES show. Technicolor were emerging. And the one thing that could totally screw up broadcasters' aspirations for us to have commonality, they are saying, please, you nerds, when are you going to standardize on a feature set, including HDR, that we can actually broadcast to? And here we go with an announcement at CES. Sure, I want 100 and 120 hertz, but to consumers who are already baffled by the range of sets that they are, and broadcasters want a defined feature set to move from 4K resolution to implement HDR. I think that the high frame rate stuff, and I'm not dissing HDMI 2.1, but it must be excessively difficult for those broadcasters to know what kind of transition they can make from resolution-based UHD services up to HDR. Do you agree?
I'd like to add one thing, though, about high frame rates.
Go on.
No televisions produced to date or for the rest of 2017 will support it.
Absolutely.
Whatsoever.
Absolutely.
Ever.
Well, I think...
No, because it requires hardware modifications that are not possible to retrofit.
Correct. Totally correct. And that's why I say it's double-edged sword. Technically, it's brilliant. And I mean, if you look at all of the details in the HDMI announcement, I loved it. I mean, I was sitting reading the press announcement. I don't usually pay much attention to that. And I thought, boy, if you deliver on that, that's going to be great. Backwardsly compatible, display compression 3:1, to enable 100 and 120 frames per second. I'll have one of those for Christmas, just out of the interest factor. But, I'm just trying to present an overall picture. So in terms of channels deployed, this is an interesting graphic. 2 reasons. It's SES Astra, so it does give you a bit of a linear TV perspective on the marketplace. So they reckon that there are 58 UHD channels on air, and you can see the breakdown by infrastructure, by type, by region, and by satellite operator. And me and my compatriot had amazing fun arguing over this particular slide, but we agree this now. But I'd say the big thing is it's the OTT operators and VOD operators who are just operating to a different model. And it's how this actually combines, say, with hybrid operation, where, say, in a few years' time, maybe an iPlayer UHD service or any of those kind of services. So actually, the other thing that was meaning that I was quite glad to have avoided the crash on the A34.
Can I ask another stupid question,
yeah.
please? Yeah, okay. But what isn't shown there is how much of the population can see it. Or is that a stupid question?
No, that's a very, very good question. If you, in fact, actually, if you look in any of the press now, and if you like, I'll put after this, I'll put a top 5 cynics questions about UHD screen deployments, because they always go for a technology really to rage. They talk about, sort of 15-20% adoption rates. That's when it's going to really kick in. And I've no doubt that will happen. If you look at the number of screen deployments, consumers get it. The people who are involved in the post-production environment get it. They're all producing 4K content, buying 4K screens. Traditional broadcast manufacturers are struggling. That I could very simply say, just look at the UHD screen sales. But that would be belying the fact that most people are watching upscaled HD. And really, that's quite a low channel count in relation. So optimistically, it shows the potential, but the buying public could reverse to cynicism when they don't see services broadcast.
Without wishing to be negative, how many years ago is it? We could have been talking about 3D. 3D is going to be wonderful. Oh.
Yes. Who said that 3D was going to be wonderful? The interesting thing is, no. The interesting thing is the consumer electronics manufacturers, because they've never made any money out of televisions for about the past 30 years. It was not the broadcasters. Exactly the same thing has happened with HD. Why is HD interlaced? And also why my American brethren work at funny numbers.
Well, you're allowed to go into that kind of detail because of the body that you represent. Far be it from me to stand in here and go blindly into the progressive and interlaced debate. That would be like saying that HDR should only be used for UHD, wouldn't it? You see, you've got to laugh. You see, at least I've shown that people have been behaving. There is a particularly fantastic blog where I got very, very strident on this. and I'll go back to our Australian taxi driver. Yeah. Anyway, anyway, we'll move on. Workflow demonstrations for. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
What percentage do you think of the content on those UHD channels is actually UHD and how much is HD?
Well, even if
converted.
I used to love the people. Now I'm going to be really, really careful here. Who said mastered in 4K? I used to love that term. Now I'm going to speak very, very slowly, because anything that was done, electronic arts, graphics, was 2K. And for most people who are talking about 4K assets, a lot of them are basically 2K assets. Some of these screens do an amazingly good job in terms of upscaling, in terms of using auto SDR to HDR techniques. You could say that we're still in the midst of going from SD to HD if you look at regionalised BBC at the moment. That gives you an idea that where we actually are, that we're not a true HD world now. It is more than true for UHD, that a frighteningly small proportion of what we'll do, and I would argue that most people who would be purporting to have a UHD channel will essentially be remastered 2K assets presented as 4K material with an occasional pop-up of a Super Bowl or Six Nations or something like that for some time yet, because of the complexity of doing this.
Which they could have done with a UHD set at home and an HD.
Correct. Correct.
Reception.
Correct. And I only put this in here because if you've we did, I'll bang my own drum here. We did a live workflow for UHD with HDR, and this nearly killed me actually doing this, trying to actually make this work because it was seriously difficult. And that is what broadcasters are trying to contend with when they move from 4K resolution services to full HDR. There are some decisions, and the decisions basically are, we're at phase A type implementations for 4K resolution, and we're moving to phase B. You'll notice that HDR is viewed as a phase A development, where it was, factored in, with the DVB and with where they are. I'd argue that the reality is that it pops into a phase B because most of the standardization effort to date has been documenting history. And really the challenge is implementing all of these new things into sort of a defined service. God, I'm bad on this clicker at the moment, aren't I? Just in terms of takeaways on the metadata thing, metadata schemes are very, very difficult to handle in workflows, and I think it's yet to be standardized, really, yet to be proved. There are a lot of difficult things going on there. Even for audio description being co-timed with video and data, that is massively difficult within workflows, that you imagine escalating that by 10, different scene types, different descriptions, different capture modes. You realize the size and scope of what Sempti and other people who've got far more patience resolving those kind of issues than me. Grading needs to handle a wide variety of different display types going on to your OLED and QLED. Most of what's going on at the moment is grading for a specific screen technology. We need to have grading that's ubiquitous. In terms of backwards compatibility, that is the key issue. Most of the content is HD, SDR content, and it's as much an issue for legacy content as it is for the existing production infrastructure. Simulcast transmission schemes are not popular. That basically you will not succeed having the best UHD, HDR scanner on a pitch if there is no viable route to go to an HDR, SDR version of it, because you are not representing the vast majority of the paying punters for that particular service. UHD production needs to be more manageable even within a software domain. You look at anyone who's actually doing UHD production, it's a Heath Robinson affair at the moment, and frequently involves lots of former coffee trolleys and things like that, with loads of equipment on there, not standardized, not the kind of thing that scales at the moment. And the yeah, you see, I didn't even say that. You see, that was very good. But the thing is it's not scalable, and it comes from the fact that 4K is predominantly a cinematic format that is yet to get that kind of television production workflow. And I think this last thing is that hand in hand with the introduction of UHD services, a move towards IP and virtualization.
Hi there. Hello.
Hi there.
You were talking about challenges on the skill sets that you needed in order to deploy applications on the cloud, so DevOps and stuff like this. Could you elaborate a little bit on, what new skill sets you needed, what were the challenges there?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. I think the first challenge is approaches. In the video industry, we're used to mapping functionality to products or production workflows. I think that a lot of what people are trying to achieve with cloud-based infrastructure is to get consistency in terms of the support skill set, the kind of infrastructure that the company already adopts. And I think one of the big challenges is the changing mindset for essentially people who are used to implementing a broadcast workflow to fit in with the rest of an organization. So I think there's that on one hand. I think the other thing is video workflows have been very deterministic. All our standards have all been based on SDI, ASI, deterministic delivery. And there's one slide that I often give when I do sort of SEMPTE presentations, which is a compare and contrast between IP and SDI deterministic, packet loss versus deterministic. Now, I know that that's, if you like, on the fringe of your cloud, but it's fundamental. And I mean, in many respects, a lot of the issues aren't cloud specific, but they are specific to an IP type workflow, an IP type deployment. So I have, in fact, at last NAB, I did a paper that was specifically about the SDI to IP type transition and what that actually meant to a workflow. But you specifically asked a question about cloud, and I think that this aspect of consumption patterns, scaling, expertise in terms of security and reach, they are really determining a lot of the decisions that broadcasters are making between administering a private cloud or basically adopting public cloud infrastructure like Amazon or Google. And I think those are fundamentally different because I think the business case associated with that, the reach, the maturity of the kind of deployment and the skill set needed, because you need to have a lot of skill set in-house to be able to do things as a private cloud versus buying it off the shelf. And I think those are the commercial realities that are actually driving the business. And they're now, video has always viewed itself as being a distinct industry that was so much on the bleeding edge in terms of performance and capability. But now we're genuinely seeing it as an enterprise application. And that's basically what we have got to get used to in our business, that even in production workflows, that we are no longer commissioning bespoke production equipment. We are fitting in with what the rest of our organisation is doing in terms of back office enterprise infrastructure and what is needed to get the kind of efficiencies so that we can restore margin into the business, because a lot of people working in the broadcast industry are having a really challenging time because it's an expensive business.
You indicated on one of your slides about 20 ago.
It's not an acronym, is it?
Constant intensity as opposed to constant luminance. And I wondered whether you were in a position to give us an indication of what the advantages of constant intensity are over constant luminance.
God, you know what? I was too glib because now I think I'm not in a position on that, because I mean I've had it presented, because I mean the constant luminance type crowd has dominated recently, and I haven't heard somebody ask me about the constant intensity issue coming up. Am I right, Mr. SEMPTE? Because it's all the constant luminance crowd who are actually driving a lot of the...
My suggestion, Mike, is that you send some... Mike, my suggestion would be you send Simon Gauntlet a note with that query, simon.gauntlet@dolby.com, and he will be able to...
because he'll come up with the ICTP...
Yes, precisely.
Now, I'll tell you what, I'll send you a paper. I can't succinctly answer because the whole... Well, okay, I will. I've been given enough thinking time on it that I can come up with what it is. A lot of the issues that are to do with backwards compatibility, they're to do with going 2020 to 709. One of the best demonstrations that I saw of the problems about colour flips, particularly on the edges of colour gamuts, are associated with the transition, say, from 2020 to 709, particularly where it's at the edges. Most of the work that's been done on constant intensity versus constant luminance have been trying to address those kind of colour flips. Now, they've traditionally happened on, I think it's the Lakers use a particular gold, yellowy gold top, And the best demonstration that I saw at CES was somebody said, here's the Lakers shirt, here's it in 709, and here's it in 2020. That most of the work that's been done, and I think the reason why constant intensity has been resurrected is because that Lakers shirt type analogy and the change from 2020 to 709, there's also some superbike coverage that the EBU use with a Repsol oil, reds, oranges, and I think Sony picked up on it where they actually had a full Repsol superbike on there and they had all of the different HDR schemes. That's the justification going, and it does go back to the fundamental colour science. And I think that both Dolby and Technicolor are resurrecting this because, as I said earlier, it comes back to the business issue of it is not worth capturing something as UHD, HDR if there's no viable route back through 709 and SDR. And that's why it's coming up. But in terms, I'll put some paper references in there. I'm not an authority on the comparing and contrasting constant intensity versus constant luminance.
If I can just make from the perspective that I've looked at it, the constant luminance has been dropped from 2020. So constant luminance is now not a standard that is likely to see the light of day again. And therefore one has to ask the question, why was it dropped? It's the comparison between constant luminance and constant intensity, which I'm interested in, but the comparisons are always shown between constant intensity and 709. And of course there's a big advantage in constant intensity, but the same advantages also accrue to constant luminance, which is a very much simpler system.
Yeah. Well, you clearly looked at it in way more detail than I have. There's a frightening book on HDR and wide colour gamut that's a whole load of academic papers that I've only ever been able to get a little way through. Perhaps I need to read that, but I failed at the end by being asked a too difficult question. And I said, you should look at what Dolby and Simon Gauntlet and perhaps have a chat with the BBC as well, because they've got a lot to say on this.
I've done both of those things.
Okay. And they still didn't answer the question? Okay. Oh, well, maybe I'm not such a failure then. I'll mark myself, okay, I'll join that gang.
Could you just say something on the delivery of 4K to our homes? At the moment, we have to subscribe to the like of Netflix, and I don't know if they deliver the proper package with HDR and all that it should be. What's happening on the satellite front? Are we going to get any feeds there?
Oh, I think most of the big broadcasters are eyeing it up. They are doing proof of concept trials. Some of the big American Big Five networks are all experimenting and all doing things. It all comes back to what screens you're actually addressing out in the market and what support they've got. And if you want a really challenging job, or you want a really awkward panel session, you have somebody like me who's got no speaking opportunity sitting in the audience sort of saying, what's your rollout strategy? Because it is really, really difficult for this. And I think that the way broadcasters are dealing with it is either they're getting prescriptive about it and saying, with our swanky new box, we'll subsidise this particular screen and we'll guarantee it with it. Or they're holding off and waiting until there's that defined feature set that's commonly available in households.
Do you see it going IP way or?
Now, that's an interesting question. For most of the, it's an open battle. And I mean, on our shores, you've got BT with BT Sport, internet-based delivery using some multicast techniques. You've got the satellite provision where a lot of the SD provision has been squeezed down into a smaller payload to make way for UHD channels. So, and I mean, even with cable, it's still the same players and the same delivery techniques are available. I think that IP will have more of a showing simply because the early success for 4K services and the early content availability is cinematic. So it does have a slight bias towards the catch-up and IP based systems.
Thank you.
And of course, Sky is the UK's second largest ISP.
Any further questions? Oh.
Hi. Can you see what compression standards can you see being implemented in compressed video over IP? Because there's TCO, VC2, etc. But for light compression. But can you see,
Oh, I think, I mean, one of the reasons why I was, Mark would probably like this, one of the reasons why I was being a little bit glib about 2022-6 is uncompressed, particularly in the production domain. Even if you've laid out recently a 3 gig infrastructure, you're already busting that. And a lot of the light compression is an enabler to get it to exist even on the latest network infrastructure on a LAN. So basically the TCO type standards that are trying to make that awkward position between mastering format that's uncompressed and acceptable library distribution production format, I think that's key. And within those production workflows, I think that what is a general trend is that more and more compression is being used further and further up the workflow as a key enabler to allow it to work on infrastructure. And I think that that's crucial at the moment. And I mean, that's why I referenced all of the work that SEMPTE are doing to basically widen the number of production codecs that are catered for under 2022 and under the VSF work, because that's all about the headers there. So I do see it going on apace, and I do see less uncompressed video, and that's why I find it that's why I called out the fact that 2022-6 is just the start of it, and it's an enabler for that style of carriage, but I would expect more of it to be compressed.
Perhaps a bit off topic, but DTT is being heavily squeezed, as you did allude to. Do you think there's a chance that eventually even HD might disappear, and what would happen to standard definition? I mean, my own feeling, again, a bit off topic, I think it would be good to have some kind of residue service, maybe on a couple of single frequency networks. Have you any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's down to commercials, and it's down to the 700 megahertz clearance. It's Ofcom. It's a. I think I always like the FM DAB analogy and how long. Aren't I allowed to do that?
As of a couple of months ago, or last month, when are we now, February, this month, Norway switched off part or a whole of their FM network, and the Norwegians are up in arms about it because it was just precipitately. Most people in this country want to keep FM, the consumers, and the reason that the DAB hasn't done very well, if you watch the figures over the last 5 years, it's been in snail pace of getting the listening figures up, and it's because DAB is not the dominant part of consumption in digital. They're counting the whole of digital, pretending it's DAB, and it's not.
I have a DAB thing in my car. I have an FM thing in my car. DAB sucks.
I used to love when DAB, when the JICRA figures for 6 Music on DAB came up with the fact that there were 36,000 listeners. And when I first left Tamberg and went to Invivio, was my first experience working at home. And frankly, DAB's being unsuccessful was magic for me, because you had more than an odds-on chance if you rang up and suggested album of the day on the breakfast show on radio to getting it. And I tell you, the delight, 3 times I managed to get album of the day. And when you're sitting there listening, saying, this is, there are a whole load of other middle-aged suckers like me listening to this. This is fantastic. Oh, no, you know what, yeah.
Quick question. Hang on. This is absolutely fascinating, and it's a completely different area of our industry to the one that I work in, which is actually working in outside broadcast mostly and sort of generating the content. One thing that I noticed now we do quite a lot in UHD, covering sport in UHD, and looking at the returning picture coming back from the satellite, it's about 7 seconds that it takes between the event happening and the picture being received. Do you see that degree of latency as being an issue? Are there any...
I definitely do. Now, I think that there are a number of points that you bring up for OB. First of all, well, especially because most of us are British here, we love to moan about things, that I've dwelt on all of the difficulties of UHD distribution. Fact of the matter is, if people are putting in provision now, a lot of the esoterics that I'm talking about HDR delivery to the home don't exist in your kind of environment. They're just putting cameras in that have got the capability, assuming that all of this is going to be sorted out downstream.
It's all standard dynamic range still.
Well, but the point that I would say is, I mean, it directly relates to the challenge that any of these compression codecs being applied, the price that used to be paid for codecs that would be used in contribution type applications used to be very, very high. We used to be able to put a lot of money into getting latency low. Now the economics have shifted that for any of these standards, you get the dilemma where people are using IP-based contribution. So you are introducing the buffer models, you're introducing multipath. Some very savvy broadcasters have very fast MPLS networks and guaranteed bandwidth that are more akin to ASI an MPEG transport stream. And one of the reasons why people are going to these simplified codecs now, and why things like TICO, and why I make so much emphasis of what comes after 2022, is these stripped down super fast codecs that are essentially iframe only type codecs, achieving milder rates of compression to just squeeze in to fibre provision. Because the kind of problems that you're talking about, you've probably got a 1 gig choke somewhere down there in one part of your network that forces you to use a codec stage. And it does come back to your point about my little asterisk saying immaturity, because anyone developing a codec now, chances are if they're developing an HEVC codec, it will be for distribution purposes. And the cycle of these things has tended to be the standard gets established, and then as you saw on slide 16 to 20, that most of the work that was associated with AVC and HEVC is the professional profiles and the professional applications, and that's where they try and attack the latency quite hard. But I do think that in the past we've seen MPEG standards migrate upstream and be used in a professional context. Now what you're seeing is a lot of the production standards migrating downstream, and I think that in many ways a lot of their suitability to the kind of networks that the broadcasters have is much, much better. And you are seeing some kickback that whereas in the MPEG-2 days it was a given that there was going to be a 42 10-bit variant, I think because of the complexity and some of the latency issues of the bit rates that are associated with that kind of acquisition, that I think that, in my opinion, supporting the production standards in an IP environment like VSF and SEMPTI are doing makes far more sense than trying to squeeze more mileage out of compression standards that are really tweaked towards getting the end efficiency out in distribution. But that's my take. There are other opinions on that.